Dear devotees, welcome back to the daily readings of Srila Prabhupada's books. Apologies for not being with you last night, but anyway, we're here today, right here in the live studios in Hyde, Kent, Southeast England, just near the English Channel. We anticipated to have our new updated camera. I just got the latest phone, which has a really good camera, but there were complications in setting it up as usual. So we're doing it from our old phone, from our normal camera. But we're here and we're a little late, so let's get started. Srimad Bhagavata Mahima Stotram from Sri Krishna Lila Stava by Srila Sanatana Goswami. A beautiful glorification of the Srimad Bhagavatam and by connection to Krishna, to the Bhagavad-gita. Goes like this. Sarva Shastra Dipiyusha Sarva Vedaika Satpala Sarva Siddhanta Ratnaja Sarva Lokaika Drikprada. O nectar from the ocean of all scriptures, singular fruit of all the Vedas, rich mine of the precious gems of all conclusive truths, you are the only giver of sight to all the worlds. Sarva Bhagavata Prana Srimad Bhagavata Prabho Kali Dvandodita Aditya Sri Krishna Parivartita. O life air of all the Supreme Lord's devotees, O Master Srimad Bhagavatam, you are the sun risen in the darkness of Kali. You are the exact image of Sri Krishna. Paramananda Pataya Prema Varshakshadayate Sarvada Sarvasevyaya Sri Krishnaya Namostume. I bow down to you, who are supremely blissful to read. Your every syllable pours down a flood of prema. You can always be served by everyone. You are Sri Krishna himself. Madeka Bando Matsangin Madguru Man Mahadana Man Nistadaka Mad Bhagya Mad Ananda Namostute. My only friend, my constant companion, my spiritual master, my great wealth, my savior, my good fortune, my source of ecstasy, I bow down to you. Asadu Saduta Dayin Atini Chochaktakada Anamunchagadachin Mam Premna Rit Kantayokspura. O bestower of saintliness to the unsaintly, O exalter of the most fallen, please never leave me. Always appear in my heart and my voice with pure love. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, here we are. We have reached the 13th chapter, quite a philosophical chapter. Krishna is now going to elaborate from the 13th chapter on of the different things he's already said, but he's elaborating on the details. This chapter is called The Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. And we reached text 4. Tat chetrang yat chayadrikcha yad vikari yatascha yat satchayog yat satchayog chatyayo yat prabhavascha tat samasena me shrinu. Now please hear my brief description of the field of activity and how it is constituted, what its changes are, whence it is produced, who that knower of the field of activities is, and what his influences are. Purport. The Lord is describing the field of activities and the knower of the field of activities in their constitutional positions. One has to know how this body is constituted, the materials of which this body is made, under whose control this body is working, how the changes are taking place, where from the changes are coming, what the causes are, what the reasons are, what the ultimate goal of the living individual soul is, and what the actual form of the individual soul is. Quite a sentence. One should also know the distinction between the individual living soul and the supersoul, their different influences, their potentials, and so on. One just has to understand this Bhagavad-gita directly from the description given by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and all this will be clarified. But one should be careful not to consider the Supreme Personality of Godhead in everybody to be one with this individual soul, the jiva. This is something like equating the potent and the impotent. Text 5. Rishibir Bahuda Gitam Chandobir Bibidai Pritak Brahmasutra Pradaischaiva Hetumadbir Vinishchitahi. That knowledge of the field of activities and of the knower of activities is described by various sages in various Vedic writings. It is especially presented in Vedanta Sutra with all reasoning as to cause and effect. Purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, is the highest authority in explaining this knowledge. Still, as a matter of course, learned scholars and standard authorities always give evidence from previous authorities. Krishna is explaining this most controversial point regarding the duality and non-duality of the soul and the supersoul by referring to a scripture, the Vedanta, which is accepted as authority. First he says, this is according to different sages. As far as the sages are concerned, besides himself, Vyasadeva, the author of the Vedanta Sutra, is a great sage. And in the Vedanta Sutra, duality is perfectly explained. And Vyasadev's father, Parashara, is also a great sage. And he writes in his books of religiosity, Aham Tvam Chatatanye. We, you and I, and various other living entities are all transcendental, although in material bodies. I'll read that again. And Vyasadev's father, Parashara, is also a great sage, and he writes in his books of religiosity, Aham Tvam Cha Tatanye. We, you, I, and the various other living entities are all transcendental, although in material bodies. Now we are fallen into the ways of the three modes of material nature, according to our different karma. As such, some are on higher levels, and some are in the lower nature. The higher and lower natures exist due to ignorance and are being manifested in an infinite number of living entities. But the Supersoul, which is infallible, is uncontaminated by the three qualities of nature and is transcendental. Similarly, in the original Vedas, a distinction between the soul, the supersoul, and the body is made, especially in the Katha Upanishad. There are many great sages who have explained this, and Parashara is considered principal among them. The word Chandobhihi refers to the various Vedic literatures. The Taittiriya Upanishad, for example, which is a branch of the Yajur Veda, describes nature, the living entity, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As stated before, Kshetra is the field of activities, and there are two kinds of Kshetragya, the individual living entity and the Supreme living entity. As stated in the Taittiriya Upanishad 2.5.1, Brahma Puchcham Pratishta, there is a manifestation of the Supreme Lord's energy known as Annamaya, dependence on food for existence. This is a materialistic realization of the Supreme. Then, in Pranamaya, after realizing the Supreme Absolute Truth in food, one can realize the Absolute Truth in the living symptoms or life forms. In Jnanamaya, realization extends beyond the living symptoms to the point of thinking, willing, feeling, thinking, feeling, and willing. Then there is Brahman realization, called Vijnana Maya, in which the living entity's mind and life symptoms are distinguished between the living entity himself. The next and supreme stage is Anandamaya, realization of the all-blissful nature. Thus there are 5 stages of Brahman realization, which are called Brahma Puchcham. Out of these, the first 3, Annamaya, Pranamaya, and Jnanamaya, involve the fields of activities of the living entities. Transcendental to all these fields of activities is the Supreme Lord, who is called Ananda Maya. The Vedanta Sutra also describes the Supreme by saying Anandamayo Vyasat. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is by nature full of joy. To enjoy his transcendental bliss, he expands into Vijnanamaya, Pranamaya, Jnanamaya, and Annamaya. In the field of activities, the living entity is considered to be the enjoyer, and different from him is the Anandamaya. That means that if the living entity decides to enjoy in dovetailing himself with the Anandamaya, then he becomes perfect. This is the real picture of the Supreme Lord and the Supreme Knower of the field. The living entity as the subordinate knower and the nature of the field of activities. One has to search for this truth in the Vedanta Sutra or Brahma Sutra. As mentioned here, it is mentioned here that the codes of the Brahma Sutra are very nicely arranged according to cause and effect. Some of the sutras or aphorisms are Na Vidyad Ashrute 232, Natma Shrute 2318, and Paratu Touch Shrute 2340. The first aphorism indicates the field of activities, the second indicates the living entity, and the third indicates the Supreme Lord, the summum bonum among all the manifestations of various entities. Texts 6 and 7. Mahabhutanyahankaro buddhir avyaktameva cha indriyani dashaikam cha panchachendriyat gochadaha ichcha dveshak sukham dukham sanghatas chetana dritihi etat chetram samasena savikaram udaritam. The 5 great elements: false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested. I'll read that again. The 5 great elements: the false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses in the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms and convictions. All these are considered, in summary, to be the field of activities and its interactions. I will read that again. This is so important. The 5 great elements: false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses in the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms and convictions. All these are considered, in summary, to be the field of activities and its interactions. Purport. From all the authoritative statements of the great sages, the Vedic hymns, and the aphorisms of the Vedanta Sutra, components of this world can be understood as follows. The components of this world can be understood as follows. First there are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These are the 5 great elements, Maha, Bhuta. Then there are false ego, intelligence, and the unmanifested stage of the 3 modes of nature. Then there are 5 senses for acquiring knowledge, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. Then 5 working senses, voice, legs, hands, anus, and genitals. Then above the senses, there is the mind, which is within and which can be called the sense within. Therefore, including the mind, there are 11 senses altogether. Then there are the 5 objects of the senses: smell, taste, form, touch, and sound. Now the aggregate of these 24 elements is called the field of activity. If one makes an analytical study of these 24 subjects, then he can very well understand the field of activity. Then there are desire, hatred, happiness, and distress, which are interactions, representations of the 5 great elements in the gross body. The living symptoms, represented by consciousness and convictions, are the manifestation of the subtle body, mind, ego, and intelligence. These subtle elements are included within the field of activities. The 5 great elements are the gross representation of the false ego, which in turn represents the primal stage of false ego, technically called the materialistic conception, or tamasa buddhi, intelligence in ignorance. This further represents the unmanifested stage of the 3 modes of material nature. The unmanifested modes of material nature are called pradhan. One who desires to know the 24 elements in detail, along with their interactions, should study the philosophy in more detail. In Bhagavad-gita, a summary only is given. The body is the representation of all these factors, and there are changes of the body, which are 6 in number. The body is born, it grows, it stays, it produces byproducts, then it begins to decay, and at the last stage, it vanishes. Therefore, the field is a non-permanent material thing. However, the Kshetrajna, the knower of the field, is its proprietor, is different. Text 8 through 12. Now we're going to find out what real knowledge is. Please listen to these verses 8 through 12 and its purport, which I hope we have a time to read the whole thing. It's a long purport. Read very carefully, or hear very carefully, please. Amanitvam adambitvam ahimsa chantir arjavam acharyo pasanam shaucham stairyam atma vinigraha indriyarteshu vairagyam anahankara evacha janma mrityu jarabhyadhi dukkha dosha nudarshanam asaktir anabhishvanga putradara grihadishu nityam chasamachittatvam ishta nishto prapatishu Mayi chananya yogena Mayi chananya yogena Bhaktir avya vicharini Bibikta deshase vitvam Aritir janasang sadi Adhyatma jnana nityatvam tatpagyanartha darshanam etaj jnanam iti proktam ajnanam yadaton. Humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, aspiring to live any solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge, and besides this, whatever there may be, is ignorance. Purport. This process of knowledge is sometimes misunderstood by less intelligent men as being the interaction of the field of activity. But actually, this is the real process of knowledge. If one accepts this process, then the possibility of approaching the absolute truth exists. This is not the interaction of the 24 elements as described before. This is actually the means to get out of the entanglement of those elements. The embodied soul is entrapped by the body, which is a casing made of the 24 elements. And the process of knowledge, as described here, is the means to get out of it. Of all the descriptions of the process of knowledge, the most important point is described in the first line of the 11th verse. Mai chanyanya yogina bhaktir abhyavicharini. The process of knowledge terminates in unalloyed devotional service to the Lord. So if one does not approach, or is not able to approach, the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. I'll read that again. So if one does not approach, or is not able to approach, the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. But if one takes to devotional service in full Krishna consciousness, the other 19 items automatically develop within him. As stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 5.18.12, Yasyasti bhaktir bhagavatya kinchana sarvair gunais tatra samasate suraha. All the good qualities of knowledge develop in one who has attained the stage of devotional service. The principle of accepting a spiritual master, as mentioned in the 8th verse, is essential. Even for one who takes to devotional service, it is most important. Transcendental life begins when one accepts a bona fide spiritual master. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, clearly states here that this process of knowledge is the actual path. Anything speculated beyond this is nonsense. Let's sink in for a second. As for the knowledge outlined here, the items may be analyzed as follows. Humility means that one should not be anxious to have the satisfaction of being honored by others. The material conception of life makes us very eager to receive honor from others. But from the point of view of a man in perfect knowledge, who knows that he is not this body, anything, honor or dishonor, pertaining to this body is useless. One should not be hankering after this material conception. One should not be, excuse me, I'm going to reread this, I made a mistake. One should not be hankering after this material deception. People are very anxious to become famous for their religion, and consequently, sometimes it is found that without understanding the principles of religion, one enters into some group which is not actually following religious principles, and then wants to advertise himself as a religious mentor. As for actual advancement in spiritual science, one should have a test to see how far he is progressing. He can judge by these items. Nonviolence is generally taken to mean not killing or destroying the body. But actually, nonviolence means not to put others into distress. People in general are trapped by ignorance in the material conception of concept of life, and they perpetually suffer material pains. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. One should try his best to distribute real knowledge to the people, so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement. That is nonviolence. Tolerance means that one should be practiced to bear insult and dishonor from others. If one is engaged in the advancement of spiritual knowledge, there will be so many insults and so much dishonor from others. This is expected because material nature is so constituted. Even a boy like Prahlad, who only 5 years old, was engaged in the cultivation of spiritual knowledge. Even a boy like Prahlad, who, only 5 years old, was engaged in the cultivation of spiritual knowledge, was endangered when his father became antagonistic to his devotion. The father tried to kill him in so many ways, but Prahlad tolerated him. So there may be many impediments to making advancement in spiritual knowledge, but we should be tolerant and continue our progress with determination. Simplicity means that without diplomacy, one should be so straightforward that he can disclose the real truth even to an enemy. As for acceptance of the spiritual master, that is essential, because without the instruction of a bona fide spiritual master, one cannot progress in the spiritual science. One should approach the spiritual master with all humility and offer him all services so that he will be pleased to bestow his blessings upon the disciple. Because a bona fide spiritual master is a representative of Krishna, if he bestows any blessings upon his disciple, that will make the disciple immediately advanced without the disciples following the regulated principles, or the regulated principles will be easier for one who has served the spiritual master without reservation. Cleanliness is essential for making advancement in spiritual life. There are two kinds of cleanliness, external and internal. External cleanliness means taking a bath. But for internal cleanliness, one has to think of Krishna always and chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This process cleans the accumulated dust of past karma from the mind. Steadiness means that one should be very determined to make progress in spiritual life. Without such determination, one cannot make tangible progress. And self-control means that one should not accept anything which is detrimental to the path of spiritual progress. One should become accustomed to this and reject anything which is against the path of spiritual progress. This is real renunciation. The senses are so strong that they are always anxious to have sense gratification. One should not cater to these demands, which are not necessary. The senses should only be gratified to keep the body fit so that one can discharge his duty in advancing in spiritual life. The most important and uncontrollable sense is the tongue. If one can control the tongue, then there is every possibility of controlling the other senses. The function of the tongue is to taste and to vibrate. Therefore, by systematic regulation, the tongue should always be engaged in tasting the remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna and chanting Hare Krishna. As far as the eyes are concerned, they should not be allowed to see anything but the beautiful form of Krishna. That will control the eyes. Similarly, the ears should be engaged in hearing about Krishna, and the nose in smelling the flowers offered to Krishna. This is the process of devotional service. And it is understood here that Bhagavad-gita is simply expounding the science of devotional service. Devotional service is the main and sole objective. Unintelligent commentators on the Bhagavad-gita try to divert the mind of the reader to other subjects. But there is no other subject in Bhagavad-gita than devotional service. False ego means accepting this body as oneself. When one understands that he is not his body and his spirit soul, he comes to his real ego. Ego is there. False ego is condemned, but not real ego. In the Vedic literature, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad 1.4.10, it is said, Ahang Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I am spirit. This I am, the sense of self, also exists in the liberated stage of self-realization. This sense of I am is ego, but when the sense of I am is applied to this false body, it is false ego. When the sense of self is applied to reality, that is real ego. There are some philosophers who say we should give up our ego, but we cannot give up our ego because ego means identity. We ought, of course, to give up the false identification with the body. One should try to understand the distress of accepting birth, death, old age, and disease. There are descriptions in various Vedic literatures of birth. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, the world of the unborn, the child's stay in the womb of the mother, its suffering, and so on, are all very graphically described. It should be thoroughly understood that birth is distressful because we forget how much distress we have suffered within the womb of the mother. We do not make any solution to the repetition of birth and death. Similarly, at the time of death, there are all kinds of sufferings, and they are also mentioned in the authoritative scriptures. These should be discussed. And as far as disease and old age are concerned, everyone gets practical experience. No one wants to be diseased, and no one wants to become old. But there is no avoiding these. Unless we have a pessimistic view of this material life, considering the distresses of birth, death, old age, and disease, there is no impetus for our making advancement in spiritual life. As for detachment from children, wife, and home, it is not meant that one should have no feeling for these. They are natural objects of affection. But when they are not favorable to spiritual progress, then one should not be attached to them. The best process for making the home pleasant is Krishna consciousness. If one is in full Krishna consciousness, he can make his home very happy, because this process of Krishna consciousness is very easy. One need only chant, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Accept the remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna. Have some discussion on books like Bhagavad-gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and engage oneself in deity worship. These 4 things will make one happy. One should train the members of his family in this way. The family members can sit down morning and evening and chant together, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. If one can mold his family life in this way, to develop Krishna consciousness, following these 4 principles, then there is no need to change from family life to renounced life. But if it is not congenial, not favorable for spiritual advancement, then family life should be abandoned. One must sacrifice everything to realize or serve Krishna. Just as Arjuna did. Arjuna did not want to kill his family members, but when he understood that these family members were impediments to his Krishna realization, he accepted the instruction of Krishna and fought and killed them. In all cases, one should be detached from the happiness and distress of family life, because in this world, one can never be fully happy or fully miserable. Happiness and distress are concomitant factors of material life. One should learn to tolerate, as advised in Bhagavad-gita. One can never restrict the coming and going of happiness and distress. So one should be detached from the materialistic way of life and be automatically equipoised in both cases. Generally, when we get something desirable, we are very happy. And when we get something undesirable, we are distressed. But if we are actually in the spiritual position, these things will not agitate us. To reach that stage, we have to practice unbreakable devotional service. Devotional service to Krishna without deviation means engaging oneself in the 9 processes of devotional service: chanting, hearing, worshipping, offering respect, and so on, as described in the last verse of the 9th chapter. That process should be followed. Naturally, when one is adapted to the spiritual way of life, he will not want to mix with materialistic men. That would go against his grain. One may test himself by seeing how far he is inclined to live in a solitary place without unwanted association. Naturally, a devotee has no taste for unnecessary sporting or cinema going, or enjoying some social function, because he understands that these are simply a waste of time. There are many research scholars and philosophers who study sex life or some other subject, but according to Bhagavad-gita, such research work and philosophical speculation have no value. That is more or less nonsensical. According to Bhagavad-gita, one should make research by philosophical discretion into the nature of the soul. One should make research to understand the self. That is recommended here. As far as self-realization is concerned, it is clearly stated here that Bhakti Yoga is especially practical. As soon as there is a question of devotion, one must consider the relationship between the Supersoul and the individual soul. The individual soul and the Supersoul cannot be one, at least not in the Bhakti conception, the devotional conception of life. This service of the individual to soul, to the Supreme Soul, this service of the individual soul to the Supreme Soul is eternal, nityam, as it is clearly stated. So bhakti, or devotional service, is eternal. One should be established in that philosophical conviction. Otherwise, one is wasting his time in ignorance. In the Srimad Bhagavatam 1:2-11, this is explained. Badanti tat bhavidas tat mam yaj jnanam advayam. Those who are actually knowers of the Absolute Truth know that the Self is realized in 3 different phases as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. Bhagavan is the last word in the realization of the Absolute Truth. Therefore, one should reach up to that platform of understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead and thus engage in the devotional service of the Lord. That is the perfection of knowledge. Beginning from practicing humility up to the point of realization of the Supreme Truth, the Absolute Personality of Godhead, this process is just like a staircase beginning from the ground floor and going up to the top floor. Now on this staircase, there are so many people who have reached the first floor, the second, or the third floor, and so on. But unless one reaches the top floor, which is the understanding of Krishna, he is at a lower stage of knowledge. If anyone wants to compete with God and at the same time make advancement in spiritual knowledge, he will be frustrated. It is clearly stated that without humility, understanding is not truly possible. To think oneself God is most puffed up. Although the living entity is always being kicked by the stringent laws of material nature, he still thinks, I am God, because of ignorance. The beginning of knowledge, therefore, is amanitva, humility. One should be humble and know that he is subordinate to the Supreme Lord. Due to rebellion against the Supreme Lord, one becomes subordinate to material nature. One must know and be convinced of this truth. Hare Krishna. Texts 8 through 12, chapter 13, and its purport should be memorized by every devotee. We should hear this again and again and again and again and again till we understand how it all fits together. So I'll end the reading tonight. We're a little bit late, but it was worth being a little late to hear that purport and verses in purport to be read all together at the same time. All right, Hare Krishna. If there's any comments or discussions, reflections, please be our guests. Hare Krishna.
First, there's something from Rati Manjari.
Rati Manjari, first of the block. I'm so happy to see it.
She says,
or hear it.
Jai Guru Maharaj, good to see you again.
Hare Krishna, nice to hear you again.
And from Gopakanya Devi Dasi.
Haribo Gopikanya Devi Dasi.
Hare Krishna, dear Maharaj and all friends assembled. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai, all glories to His Divine Grace.
And from Bhakti Noel.
Hare Krishna, Bhakti Noel. Haven't heard you from you for a while.
She says, Hare Krishna, dear Maharaj. So nice to hear you read this nectar today. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. These words are a gift.
Thank you, Hare Krishna. They're the greatest gift, yes. As Prabhupada put it, when he found out that the first actual building he got for preaching had over the front door matchless gifts, he said, you keep that there. Don't change it. This is what we're giving to people.
From Anandamurti Devi Dasi.
Haribol and Anandamurti, Hare Krishna.
She says, Dear Guru Maharaj and all assembled devotees, please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai, all glories to Prabhupada.
Thank you so much for your spiritual guidance every day. I understand that I couldn't reach even the first step of humility. I would like to hear these qualities again and again. So valuable teachings.
Oh yes, very true. Well put. Thank you.
And from Rati Manjari.
Hare Krishna, Rati.
She says, it's amazing that in the purport of the verses 8 through 12, Srila Prabhupada describes in a summary of a few pages how we can live a successful life. What an understanding he has.
Totally true. Nicely put. Nicely said. Complete picture is given in these verses of how to practically get out of the material nature. Because, as Prabhupada said in the beginning of this purport, most people think that these items are a part of the material nature. But actually, these items are the means to get out of the conditioning of material nature. And at the end, what does he say? Knowledge begins from humility. You can't actually have knowledge unless you are humble. Knowledge does not mean information content that you have memorized and then can repeat to impress another person. Knowledge means how to know the difference between the soul and the body, why the body and how the body is entangled in material nature, and to get out of it. To be able to enjoy eternal and blissful knowledge in life, in full knowledge. Hare Krishna.
Question from Rati Manjari.
Yes, Rati.
She says, how can we come to that stage of not being eager to have the satisfaction of being honored by others?
Well, we have to apply ourselves and make an effort, but the material nature does a pretty good job. Doesn't she do a pretty good job of training us how to become free from the desire for honor? Because every time we get honored, we're smacked down. Every time. No matter who we are, no matter how great we become, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how rich, famous, strong, artistic, perfect. At some point, our body begins to decay, and we have no way to stop it. We may go to the gym, we may go to plastic surgeons, we may put on makeup, we may dress up in a way that makes us look younger, whatever, but eventually we have to leave the body and all those things behind. So one has to be philosophical enough, intelligent enough to see this for ourselves through this knowledge. And therefore, when somebody praises us, or when we do something that is laudable, we should not become intoxicated by that. We should not take it seriously. We should know that each one of us is just a speck in this universe, not even a speck. And each one of us is under the powerful control of the material nature. We're helplessly being battered, blown, swept away by the modes of material nature. So that is the mercy of the material nature. It's the mercy of Krishna upon us through the material nature to teach us that we're not the all in all. We're not the knower. We're not powerful. We're not this. We're not that. We're not the body at all. We're not the mind at all. But we can't take the easy way out and think, yes, that means I'm nothing. No, we're something. We may be insignificant, but when we're connected with Krishna, we become significant in the eyes of Krishna. And therefore, in the eyes of others. So if you become famous as a great devotee, that is proper. That is proper honor. But still we should try to avoid it. Madhavendra Puri, he tried to avoid it, but wherever he went, the honor of being a great devotee followed him. Could not escape it. So we can do that by always remembering that everything belongs to Krishna. It is being organized and managed by Krishna, and therefore nothing belongs to us. We should see ourselves as the caretakers of Krishna's energy. That's all. And take care of it, even better than we would if we thought it was ours. In that way, gradually, by acting like that, by thinking and feeling and willing and acting like that, we become free from this ghost, this witch of Maya, which always tells us, do something to make yourself famous, do something people will speak well of us, to become a big person. Hare Krishna.
Rati Manjari says, as a teenager, my main objective was to become a famous artist.
Yeah, of course.
And then she commented after, yes, Guru Maharaj, very good points. I can understand some of that by my own experiences in life.
Of course. That's the purpose of the material world, to teach us these things.
And Gopakanya Devi Dasi commented, Maharaj, your daily reading service of Srila Prabhupada's books is the matchless gift to Jai Ho.
Thank you very much, Hare Krishna. I promise you I'll continue as long as I can in this body to do this. This is the main source of my happiness. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much, everyone, for those lovely reflections and discussions and points of interest. Very, very wonderful. And all glories to Srila Prabhupada for that incredible purport in which he explains everything. Srimad Bhagavad-gita As It Is, Ki Jai. Samabheda Bhaktivedanta Ki Jai. Gaur Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. Thank you very much, everybody. See you tomorrow night. Same time, same place, same topic. The ever-expanding joy of hearing from Srila Prabhupada explain the absolute truth. Hare Krishna. See you tomorrow.